I don't know if this technically qualifies as a scary story. Nothing chased me, nobody disappeared. There wasn't some big reveal at the end. It's just one of those memories that comes back every summer whether I want it to or not. I'm 40 now. This happened when I was 12, and honestly, I probably would have forgotten about it completely if somebody hadn't brought up summer camp at a barbecue a few years ago. The second they mentioned cabins and campfires, I thought about this kid. I hadn't thought about him in almost 25 years. For privacy, I'll call him Ryan. I met him during a week-long summer camp somewhere in Pennsylvania. I couldn't even tell you exactly where anymore. The kind of place parents loved because it promised character building and outdoor experiences. A bunch of cabins, a lake, a dining hall, archery, hiking, the usual stuff. I wasn't excited to go. Most kids weren't. Every parent acted like camp was some magical, life-changing experience. Most of us were homesick and pretending we weren't. I remember arriving with a duffel bag that felt way too heavy and immediately trying to figure out who looked normal. When you're 12, that's basically how you make friends. You look for kids who seem as uncomfortable as you feel. Ryan ended up in my cabin. There were maybe 12 of us total. Bunk beds along both walls. One counselor. No air conditioning. The cabin always smelled like sunscreen, wet towels, whatever people tracked in from outside. Ryan wasn't the loudest kid there. He wasn't the quietest either. He was just, you know those people who somehow fit into every group without being the center of attention? That was him. Everybody liked him. He played basketball. He was funny, good at making people laugh. I don't remember a single person disliking him. The first few days were completely normal. Swimming during the afternoon, campfires at night, terrible camp food. I still remember the bug juice they served. If you went to summer camp in America, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. That bright red drink that tasted vaguely like fruit and chemicals. Every day followed basically the same schedule. Wake up, breakfast, activities, lunch, more activities, dinner, campfire, cabin, sleep. After a few days, you lose track of time. Everything starts blending together. The thing about summer camp is that nighttime feels different than nighttime at home. I don't know how else to explain it. At home, there are familiar sounds. Cars, neighbors, TVs, dogs barking. Camp gets quiet in a different way, especially after lights out. You hear insects, tree branches moving, the occasional screen door somewhere. Every sound feels farther away. The first weird thing happened maybe 4 days into the week. I don't remember exactly. We were getting ready for bed. People were talking, throwing pillows, messing around, normal cabin stuff. Ryan asked our counselor something. I don't remember the exact wording. Something about whether staff walked around at night. The counselor laughed, said yes. There were adults everywhere. Ryan seemed relieved by that answer. At the time, nobody thought anything of it. Looking back, I remember it because he asked similar questions afterward. Not constantly. Just enough that it stands out now. Who stayed up the latest, which cabins were closest to the woods, whether people ever got lost, stuff like that. Again, nothing dramatic. 12-year-olds ask weird questions all the time. A couple nights later, there was a campfire. One of those bigger ones where everybody sat around in circles. Some counselor told ghost stories. Terrible ghost stories. The kind adults think kids will find terrifying. Everybody spent most of the time making fun of them. On the walk back to the cabins afterward, Ryan seemed unusually quiet. I only remember that because he was usually joking around with everybody. One of the kids asked if he was okay. Ryan shrugged, said he was tired. That was it. The next day seemed normal. Swimming, basketball, lunch, nothing unusual. Then that night I woke up. Not because of anything scary. I had to use the bathroom. The bathrooms weren't inside the cabins. You had to walk to another building, which felt like a much bigger deal when you were 12. I climbed down from my bunk, tried not to wake anybody, and that's when I noticed Ryan's bed. I remember standing there for a second, mostly because it surprised me. There were plenty of reasons somebody's bed could be empty. Bathroom, couldn't sleep, talking to counselors, whatever. I didn't think much about it. I went to the bathroom and came back. His bed was still empty. That caught my attention a little, maybe because it was late, maybe because the cabin felt strangely quiet. I climbed back into bed and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, Ryan looked exhausted. The counselor even asked if he'd slept okay. Ryan laughed and said yes, then changed the subject. Life moved on. Kids don't spend much time investigating things. If somebody isn't actively causing a problem, you stop thinking about it. The final night of camp arrived before any of us were ready. That's the funny thing about being 12. You spend the first half of camp wanting to go home, then suddenly it's ending and nobody wants to leave. That last evening felt different. Everybody knew it. People were trading phone numbers, signing notebook. After the final campfire, we went back to the cabins. People stayed awake longer than usual, talking, laughing, throwing things across the room. Nobody wanted the week to end. Eventually, the counselor told us to settle down. The lights went out. The cabin slowly got quiet. I remember staring at the ceiling for a while, listening to people shifting around in their bunks, somebody snoring already, somebody whispering, the usual stuff. Then, at some point during the night, I woke up again. This time because somebody was moving around. At first I thought it was the counselor, then I realized it wasn't. It was Ryan. And what happened next is the reason I still remember that week at all. I could hear somebody moving around in the dark. At first I didn't even open my eyes. When you're half asleep, your brain does that thing where it tries to explain everything away. Somebody going to the bathroom, somebody looking for water, somebody changing beds because another kid was snoring. Normal stuff. Then I heard the cabin door open. That made me sit up. The counselor's bunk was near the door. I remember looking over and seeing he was still there. The door closed. Whoever left had gone alone. I glanced toward Ryan's bunk, empty. I don't know why I remember that moment so clearly. The room was dark. I shouldn't be able to remember details. But I do. Maybe because I was awake enough now to realize something felt off. I wasn't scared, just confused. The clock near the counselor's bed had one of those faint green displays. I remember seeing it was after 2 a.m. Then I remember thinking, whatever, and laying back down. That's honestly what happened. People always act like they would have followed somebody into the woods or investigated. Most 12-year-olds would rather go back to sleep. I definitely did. The next thing I remember is waking up in the morning. Everybody was already getting dressed, talking, packing, the usual chaos of the last day. Ryan was there, sitting on his bunk, pulling socks on, looking tired again. I asked where he went last night, just casually. The way you'd ask somebody where they got a t-shirt. He looked at me for maybe a second longer than normal, then said, I thought somebody called my name. That was his answers. I laughed. A couple other kids overheard and laughed too, because it sounded ridiculous. One of them asked who called his name. Ryan shrugged, then said something I've remembered for over 20 years. He said, I don't know. That's why I went outside. Everybody laughed again. And honestly, so did he. That's the weird part. He wasn't acting frightened. He wasn't trying to tell a ghost story. He sounded almost embarrassed, like he realized how dumb it sounded after the fact. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then everybody moved on. Breakfast, packing, parents arriving. The week ended. Life continued. If the story stopped there, I would have forgotten it years ago. Most camp memories disappear. Faces blur together. Names disappear. You remember random things instead. The smell of a lake, a song everybody sang, some terrible meal. That's usually what survives. Then about 10 years ago, something happened. Facebook happened. Or maybe that was longer than 10 years ago. I honestly don't know anymore. Time moves weird once you're an adult. A few people from camp found each other online. Somebody made a group, then somebody else joined, then another. The same thing happens with old schools and sports teams. People get nostalgic. They start remembering things. For a while, the group was mostly harmless. Old photos. People saying things like, remember the ropes course, remember cabin 7, stuff like that. Then somebody posted a campfire picture. Ryan was in it. The second I saw his face, that memory came back. The cabin, the final night, him leaving, everything. So I commented underneath the photo. I wrote something like, remember when you wandered outside because somebody called your name? I wasn't expecting much. Maybe a laugh, maybe a joke. Instead, another guy replied almost immediately. He remembered it too. Then another. Suddenly, 4 or 5 people were talking about the same thing. The weird part wasn't that they remembered. The weird part was how similarly they remembered it. Everybody remembered Ryan saying somebody called his name, almost word for word. One guy even remembered where we were standing when he said it. That's when somebody tagged Ryan. He wasn't very active in the group, but eventually he responded. I still remember reading it. The conversation had been lighthearted up until then. Then Ryan showed up and wrote, "I don't really remember that week very well." That's all. The tone changed immediately because everybody else clearly remembered it, including him saying he heard his name. One of the guys asked if he actually went outside. Ryan said yes. Another asked who he thought called him. Ryan said he didn't know. Then somebody asked the obvious question. Why did you follow the voice? No answer. Hours passed. Nothing. The next day he finally replied, and the response was strange. Not scary, strange. He said, "I guess I thought it was someone I knew." Then he left the conversation. That answer made no sense. We were in the middle of nowhere. Everybody he knew was inside the cabin. Years passed again. The story drifted away. Every once in a while somebody would mention camp. The memory would come back, then disappear again. Last summer, I ended up talking to one of the guys from that cabin. We hadn't seen each other in years. Middle-aged dads now, talking about mortgages and back pain, the exciting stuff. At some point, camp came up. Then Ryan came up, and this guy told me something I'd never heard before. Apparently, after Ryan came back to the cabin that night, he didn't immediately go to sleep. The guy had been awake. He claimed Ryan sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time, just sitting there, looking toward the door. Eventually, the guy asked if he was okay. According to him, Ryan answered, "Yeah." Then a few seconds later, "I don't think that's who I thought it was." I have no idea if that's true. Memory is weird, especially after 25 years. People accidentally rewrite things. Details shift, stories change. I know that, you know that. Still, hearing it gave me that same uncomfortable feeling I'd had as a kid. The feeling that there was a missing piece somewhere, a piece nobody ever found. A few months ago, I looked Ryan up again. We're both around 40 now, different lives, different states, families, jobs, the usual. I almost messaged him. I actually typed something out, then deleted it. Because what was I going to ask? Do you remember hearing somebody call your name at camp in 1998? Do you remember who you thought it was? Do you remember what happened after you walked outside? The truth is, I don't think I want answers anymore. The older I get, the less interested I am in solving it. What sticks with me isn't the possibility that something supernatural happened. It's the memory itself. A tired kid sitting on his bunk at 2 a.m, looking unsettled in a way 12-year-olds usually aren't, then refusing to explain it. And somehow, after all these years, that's the part none of us forgot. This happened when I was 13 at a church camp in Indiana. I'm 36 now, and I still remember this counselor's face better than some teachers I had for entire school years. Nothing terrible happened. That's probably why I still think about it. If something huge had happened, there would be an explanation, a reason, a story. Instead, it was just a week where everybody slowly got uncomfortable and nobody really understood why. The camp sat in the middle of nowhere. At least that's how it felt as a kid. There was a lake, a bunch of cabins, a chapel building, and a dining hall that somehow always smelled like pancakes, even when they weren't serving pancakes. My parents sent me there every summer, not because I loved it, because they loved it. I was one of those kids who got homesick every single year and somehow still ended up back there the following summer. You'd think I'd learn. The week started normally. Kids meeting each other, parents unloading duffel bags, everybody pretending they weren't nervous. The counselors stood around smiling and introducing themselves. Most of them were college students, maybe 20 years old, maybe younger. When you're 13, everybody over 18 looks 30. One counselor stood out immediately, Mike. Mike seemed normal, friendly, funny, the type of counselor parents instantly trusted, the type that remembered everybody's name after 10 minutes. The first thing I noticed was how serious he was about counting people, which honestly sounds ridiculous. Summer camps count kids all the time. That's part of the job. Nobody thought anything of it at first. We'd line up for activities. Mike would count, we'd head to lunch, Mike would count, we'd leave the lake, Mike would count again. Perfectly normal. A couple days passed, then people started joking about it because he counted constantly, more than any counselor I'd ever had. We'd be halfway through a basketball game and he'd suddenly stop to count. Walking between buildings, count. Standing in line for ice cream, count. Sitting around before chapel, count. One kid started calling him Count Mike. The nickname spread through half the camp. Even Mike laughed about it, at least at first. The thing is, kids notice patterns. You don't have to tell them something is weird, they figure it out themselves. By the middle of the week, everybody knew Mike was counting more than he should have been. One afternoon, we were swimming at the lake. I remember this because I got sunburned so badly, my shoulders hurt for days afterward. We'd been there maybe 30 minutes. Everybody was having fun. Nobody was causing problems. Then Mike blew his whistle. Everybody had to come back to shore. We assumed somebody broke a rule. That happened all the time. Instead, he counted us, then counted again, then a third time. A few counselors were standing nearby. One of them actually asked if something was wrong. Mike shook his head, then counted again. People started getting annoyed. Eventually, another counselor told us to go back in the water. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 minutes. At dinner that night, kids were making fun of him. Nothing mean, just camp kid jokes. One guy stood up and pretended to count French fries. Everybody laughed. Even I laughed. Then I remember looking over and seeing Mike sitting with the other counselors. He wasn't laughing. He looked distracted, like he wasn't listening to the conversation around him. The expression stuck with me because it didn't match the rest of the week. The next day felt hotter than the others. One of those Midwest summer days where the air feels heavy, the kind that makes every shirt stick to your back. A bunch of us were sitting outside our cabin after lunch, trying to stay in the shade. That's when Mike walked by. He stopped, counted us, then walked away. Nobody said anything for a second. Then one kid goes, "Dude, we're literally sitting right here." Everybody started laughing. Mike laughed too. But it sounded forced, like somebody remembering they should laugh. A few hours later, I saw him again, this time near the archery range. Same thing, counting, looking around, counting again. The memory that sticks with me most happened that evening. Nothing dramatic, actually the opposite. The weirdest moments usually are. Dinner had ended. People were heading toward the chapel for a service. The path went through a grassy area between buildings. I was walking with two friends. Mike passed us going the other direction, almost jogging. Then he stopped, turned around, and counted us, right there in the middle of the path. I remember one of my friends saying, "There's 3. Mike nodded, then looked back toward the dining hall, then toward the chapel, then counted again. For some reason, that made me uneasy, like seeing a teacher forget something obvious. Adults weren't supposed to act confused, especially camp counselors. The service started, everybody sat down, songs, announcements, the usual stuff. Halfway through, one of the younger kids started crying, nothing serious, homesick, happened every week. A counselor escorted him outside. I remember looking over and seeing Mike watching them leave, watching way longer than necessary. The service ended. Night came, campfires started, kids ran around with flashlights, the normal summer camp atmosphere returned. People forgot about Mike, mostly. Then something happened during lights out. I wasn't there for it, at least not directly. Another cabin was. Word spread the next morning. Apparently Mike had shown up at one of the boys' cabins close to midnight. Walked inside, checked every bunk, counted everybody, then left. The counselor assigned to that cabin asked what he was doing. Mike supposedly said he was making sure everybody was there. That answer didn't satisfy anybody, because everybody was obviously there. The story spread around camp by breakfast. Some people thought it was funny, some people thought it was creepy. Most people assumed there had to be a reason. There always is when adults do weird things. At least that's what kids think. That afternoon, I ended up hearing something by accident. And that's the reason I still remember that week all these years later, because for the first time, it sounded like even the other counselors didn't know what was going on. And the sentence I overheard made the whole thing feel different. The kind of wrong that sits in your stomach and stays there. I was walking past the staff building when I heard raised voices inside. I recognized one of the voices immediately. It was Mike. Then another counselor said something I couldn't hear. A few seconds later, I heard Mike answer. Very clearly. I counted 31 yesterday. There was a pause. Then he said, I counted 31 3 different times. And that's where things started getting strange. The second I heard him say that, I stopped walking. Not because I thought something supernatural was happening. Honestly, my first thought was that he was bad at math. I was 13. That's where my brain went. 31. 30. Who cares? But the way he said it stuck with me. Not the words. The tone. People sound different when they're joking, different when they're embarrassed, different when they're trying to convince somebody of something. Mike sounded frustrated, like he'd already had the same conversation multiple times. I didn't stand there listening. I wasn't trying to spy on anybody. I kept walking because getting caught eavesdropping by camp staff would have been incredibly awkward. Still, the sentence followed me around the rest of the day, mostly because I didn't understand it. There were 30 kids in our group. Everybody knew that. Cabin assignments were posted everywhere. 30 kids, not 31. That night was the talent show. Every summer camp has some version of it. Half the acts were terrible. A few kids sang, somebody attempted magic tricks. A group of boys from another cabin did a fake wrestling match that got the loudest reaction of the night. Everybody was having fun. Mike was there too, smiling, clapping, looking completely normal. I remember thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe he miscounted. Maybe he was tired. Camp counselors barely sleep. The simplest explanation usually ends up being the right one. The next morning changed that. Breakfast had just started. People were carrying trays around looking for seats. The dining hall was loud. The usual chaos. Then somebody from another cabin sat at our table and asked if we'd heard about Mike. Immediately, everybody started paying attention. Apparently, he had gotten into an argument with one of the senior staff members before breakfast. Nothing dramatic. Nobody yelling. Still unusual enough that people noticed. The rumor spread fast. Camp rumors always do. Every version was different. Somebody said Mike wanted extra head counts. Somebody said he thought campers were sneaking out at night. Somebody else claimed he'd reported a missing kid who wasn't actually missing. Nobody knew what was true. The funny thing is, I don't remember feeling scared. I remember feeling curious. That's probably more realistic. Most weird situations aren't frightening in the moment. They're confusing. The fear usually comes later when you replay things. The last full day of camp arrived. People were already talking about going home, trading addresses, writing phone numbers inside notebooks. This was before social media made staying connected effortless. Back then, every friendship felt permanent for about 48 hours. Then you never saw each other again. That afternoon, our cabin had free time. A bunch of us ended up throwing a football near the lake. At some point, the ball rolled into some tall grass. One of the younger kids ran after it, then came jogging back looking confused. He asked us something strange. "Why is Mike over there?" We all looked. Mike was standing near a tree line maybe 100 yards away, just standing there. Hands on his hips, looking toward the camp. One of my friends yelled his name. No response. Another kid waved. Nothing. A few seconds later, Mike turned and walked away. That should have been the end of it, but I remember everybody going quiet afterward. Not because it was scary, because it felt weirdly personal, like we'd accidentally walked in on something. The last night finally arrived. Everybody was excited. Last campfire, last activities, last chance to stay up too late. The atmosphere felt completely different than it had on the first day. By then, everybody knew everybody. Inside jokes had formed. Groups had formed. The homesick kids weren't homesick anymore. The whole place felt comfortable. During the campfire, I noticed Mike sitting farther away than usual. Not with the campers, not really with the staff either. Just kind of off to the side, looking tired. The next morning, parents started arriving. Camp ended. People hugged goodbye, promised to stay in touch. The usual ending. I loaded my duffel bag into my mom's minivan and never expected to think about any of it again. For years, I didn't. Life moved on. Middle school, high school, college, jobs. The camp became one of those memories you only revisit when somebody else brings it up. Then about 15 years later, I was visiting my parents. My mom keeps everything, and I mean everything. Old report cards, school photos, camp newsletters, boxes full of things nobody should still own. While helping clean out a closet, I found a stack of camp paperwork, schedules, permission slips, newsletters, stuff like that. Most of it was boring. Then I found the group photo from that year. 30 kids, a few counselors, everybody standing in front of the chapel. I started naming people I remembered, maybe 6 or 7 total. Then I noticed Mike, standing in the back row, smiling, looking completely normal. For some reason, it made me curious again. That night, I ended up searching online, mostly out of boredom. Eventually, I found somebody who had worked at that camp, not Mike, another counselor. We exchanged a few messages, talked about old camp memories. Then I brought up Mike. The response came back a day later. The counselor remembered him immediately. Apparently, everybody did. I asked if anything had ever been wrong that summer. The counselor took a while to answer, then sent a surprisingly long message. According to him, Mike had become convinced their numbers were off. Not once, repeatedly, for several days. The staff checked everything, cabin rosters, attendance sheets, activity groups, everything matched. 30 kids every single time. The counselor said they eventually thought Mike was simply exhausted, overworked, running on very little sleep, which honestly made sense. Then there was one detail, a tiny detail, the kind that keeps a story alive. The counselor told me Mike left camp early, 2 days before staff training ended. Apparently that was unusual. When they asked why, he didn't give much of an explanation, just said he needed a break. Then the counselor added something else, something he'd apparently heard secondhand years ago. On Mike's final day, somebody asked him why he'd been doing so many head counts. His answer was, because every time I counted, somebody was standing where they weren't supposed to be. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I wrote back asking what that meant. The counselor said he had no idea. Nobody did. And that's it. No missing camper, no ghost story, no dramatic ending, just a college-age counselor who became increasingly distracted during 1 week of summer camp. Maybe he was exhausted, maybe stress got to him, maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation for all of it. That's probably the answer. I almost didn't submit this because technically nothing scary happened, at least not in the way people usually mean. Nobody got hurt, nobody disappeared. There wasn't some ghost running around camp. It's just one of those memories that has stayed stuck in my head for over 20 years because I still don't understand what exactly happened. I was 12. This would have been summer of 2003, maybe 2002, one of those. My parents sent me to a church camp every year, whether I wanted to go or not. Looking back, it wasn't even a bad camp. At the time, I complained constantly. The cabins were hot, the showers smelled weird, the food somehow tasted exactly the same every day. You'd spend all morning waiting for lunch and then realize lunch was another turkey sandwich. Every kid there seemed to own the same flashlight too. I don't know why I remember that. Everybody had those chunky yellow flashlights. The camp sat on a huge property in southern Illinois. There was a lake, horse trails, sports fields, and a bunch of buildings scattered around dirt roads. The place felt enormous when I was 12. As an adult, I'd probably walk across it in 10 minutes. The week was mostly normal. Swimming, archery, crafts, the usual camp stuff. I wasn't one of the popular kids. I wasn't bullied either. I mostly floated around, talked to whoever happened to be nearby. I was shy enough that people left me alone. One afternoon, our cabin got assigned free period after lunch. That basically meant we could wander around approved areas until the next activity. Most of us headed toward the recreation building because it had air conditioning. A rare luxury at camp. I remember sitting at a table playing cards with 2 girls from my cabin. One of them was named Lauren. I remember her because she had braces with bright blue rubber bands, the kind of detail your brain randomly hangs onto. We were halfway through a game when one of the counselors walked in. She looked college-aged, maybe 19, maybe 20. I'll call her Rachel. She asked if 6 volunteers wanted to help move supplies. Nobody raised their hand. It was hot outside. Nobody wanted extra work. Then she pointed at people instead. Lauren, me, 4 other girls. That was it. We got recruited. I remember groaning because everybody else got to stay inside. Rachel told us we'd only be gone 20 minutes. I specifically remember 20 minutes because she repeated it twice. The building she took us to wasn't near any of the activity areas. At least I don't think it was. I had never seen it before. We walked down a gravel path behind the maintenance shed, then through a section of trees, nothing dense. You could still see sunlight through everything. After maybe 5 minutes, we reached this long rectangular building. Brown paint, metal roof, no signs, no windows on the front side. Honestly, it looked more like a warehouse than anything belonging at a summer camp. One of the girls asked what it was. Rachel said storage. That was the entire explanation. Storage. The inside smelled dusty, like old cardboard, old wood, the sort of smell you get when something hasn't been opened in years. There were shelves everywhere, boxes, old camp equipment, broken folding chairs, canoe paddles, plastic tubs, nothing strange, just clutter. Rachel told us they needed help sorting things. So that's what we did. At first it felt completely normal. Boring, actually. We moved boxes, stacked supplies, swept dirt. A couple girls complained the entire time. I probably complained too. The weird part isn't what happened there. The weird part is how long we were there, because 20 minutes came and went, then another 20, then another. At least it felt that way. Nobody had watches. Cell phones weren't a thing for kids back then. Time gets weird when you're 12. Still, I remember thinking we had been there forever. At one point I asked when we were leaving. Rachel said soon, then kept working. The thing I remember most is how quiet everything felt. Not spooky, just isolated. The sounds from camp seemed far away. No kids yelling, no whistles, no activities, just the 6 of us moving stuff around. Every now and then somebody would make a joke. Then things would get quiet again. Looking back, that silence is what stayed with me. Summer camps are usually loud, constantly loud. That building felt disconnected from everything else. At some point, another counselor showed up. A man this time. Older, maybe mid-20s. I had never seen him before, which was odd because camps aren't that big. By the middle of the week, you usually recognize everybody. He spoke with Rachel near the doorway. Neither seemed upset. They were talking normally. I remember seeing him point towards something outside. Then both of them walked out. We waited inside. A few minutes later, Rachel came back. The other counselor didn't. Nobody explained anything. We went back to sorting boxes. One of the girls asked where we were, not where the building was, where we were in relation to camp. Rachel laughed and said, "Still at camp." That answer made everybody laugh too. At the time, years later I started thinking about it because she never actually answered the question. Eventually she told us we could leave. The sun looked lower than I expected when we stepped outside. That immediately struck me as weird. I remember that feeling very clearly, like when you take a nap by accident and wake up convinced you've missed something. We walked back toward camp, same gravel path, same trees, nothing unusual. Then we reached the main activity area, and that's where the memory becomes strange. Because nobody seemed to realize we'd been gone. Nobody. Not our cabin counselor, not the girls in our cabin, not anybody. The evening activities were already starting. People were heading toward dinner. Everything felt like it had continued without us. Lauren actually asked another girl what happened during the afternoon. The girl looked confused. She said, "What do you mean?" Lauren explained we'd been helping move supplies. The girl stared at her for a second, then said, "You guys were at crafts." I still remember that, because all 6 of us immediately corrected her. No, we'd been in the storage building, for hours. At least that's what it felt like. The girl shrugged and walked away, like the conversation didn't matter. At the time, we laughed about it. Kids forget things. Who cares? The reason I'm writing this now is because 15 years later, I ran into Lauren completely by accident. And the first thing she asked me after recognizing me wasn't about school, wasn't about work, wasn't about family. She asked me if I remembered that storage building, which means she never forgot it either. I didn't think about that camp again for years. Honestly, I barely thought about camp at all. Most of my memories from that age got shoved into the same mental box. School dances, awkward haircuts, CD players skipping every time you bump them, stuff like that. Then one random afternoon in 2018, I got a Facebook message from Lauren. I hadn't talked to her since we were kids. I don't think we'd spoken once after middle school. The message was literally, "Do you remember that storage building?" No hello. No catching up. Just that. I laughed when I saw it because I knew exactly what she meant, which was strange by itself. There are people I knew for years whose names I've forgotten, yet somehow I instantly knew what building she was talking about. We ended up messaging back and forth for a while. At first, it felt funny. Two adults trying to piece together some random summer camp memory. The more we talked, the weirder it got. Not because either of us remembered anything scary. Actually, the opposite. The details were unbelievably ordinary. We both remembered the dusty shelves, we both remembered the folding chairs, we both remembered sweeping dirt off the concrete floor. Neither of us remembered why any of it needed to be done. There was no project, no event, no end, no explanation. Just hours spent moving things around. Lauren remembered one detail I had completely forgotten. According to her, one of the girls started crying. Not because she was scared, because she thought she'd missed horseback riding. Apparently, she'd been excited about it all week. I had no memory of that. Then Lauren mentioned something else. She asked if I remembered taking a group picture outside. I told her no. She swore it happened. 6 girls standing in front of the building. Rachel taking the photo. I couldn't remember that at all. The conversation probably would have ended there, just 2 people comparing childhood memories. Then Lauren sent another message. She said she had found her old camp photo album. And that was where things started feeling off. The camp sold photo packets at the end of every session. Parents loved them. There were hundreds of pictures, campfires, swimming, cabins, crafts, group activities, everything. Lauren had scanners. She started sending photos. I recognized most of them immediately. Kids from our cabin, the dining hall, the lake, the recreation building. Then she asked me something. "Do you notice anything?" I had no idea what she meant. Everything looked normal. Then she pointed it out. There were photos from every day of camp, morning activities, afternoon activities, even random pictures of kids standing around. The afternoon we supposedly spent in the storage building barely existed. There were pictures from before, pictures from dinner afterward. Nothing in between. That alone isn't weird. Nobody photographs everything. The part that caught my attention was one specific photo, our cabin at Crafts. The date printed underneath matched the same afternoon. Lauren was standing there, clear as day, holding a paintbrush, smiling at the camera. I remember staring at the image for a long time, because Lauren wasn't at Crafts. She was with me, in the building, moving boxes. At least that's how I remembered it. Lauren remembered it the same way. Yet there she was, in the photograph. We spent the next week trying to figure it out. Maybe the date stamp was wrong. That seemed reasonable. Old cameras weren't perfect. Then Lauren contacted another girl who had been there. I honestly forgot she existed until Lauren mentioned her. The girl remembered the building too. Not perfectly, just pieces. The smell, the shelves, the gravel path. She remembered being annoyed because she'd gotten dirt on her shoes. What she didn't remember was the counselor, Rachel. The name meant nothing to her. That surprised me because Rachel was the entire reason we were there. The third girl remembered Rachel. Didn't remember the building. The fourth remembered the building but thought it was near the lake. The fifth remembered absolutely nothing, not one detail. At this point, it sounds like bad memories. Probably because that's exactly what it was. The problem is that all of us agreed on one thing. We remembered spending hours somewhere, every single one of us. Nobody remembered what happened during the rest of that afternoon. Try that with your own memories. Think about being 12. You remember fragments, moments, embarrassing stuff, funny stuff. The timeline usually exists. This memory felt detached from everything around it, like somebody ripped pages out of the middle of a book. A year later, I ended up driving through that town for work. The camp still existed. Different owners, different website, same property. I had time to kill, so I stopped. I don't even know why. Curiosity, I guess. The place looked much smaller than I remembered. That happens with childhood locations. I parked outside and walked around. Nobody stopped me. Most of the camp was empty, off-season, quiet. The recreation building was still there. The lake was still there. The dining hall, too. I spent maybe an hour wandering around. I never found the storage building. That doesn't mean anything. The property was huge. A lot can change in 15 years. Buildings get demolished, things get moved. Still, I kept looking for that gravel path, the one I remembered so clearly. I couldn't find it. I eventually gave up, got back in my car, started driving toward the exit. Then something happened that brought the entire memory back. Near the front office, there was a display board showing old camp photos, mostly for nostalgia, parents, former campers, that sort of thing. I stopped because I recognized the year, 2003, the exact summer. There were maybe 20 pictures. I looked through all of them. Then I found one. 6 girls standing outside a building. For a second, my stomach actually dropped. I thought Lauren had been right. I thought I was looking at the photo she remembered. Then I stepped closer. The girls weren't us. Different kids entirely, different cabin, different counselors, different year. I stood there feeling ridiculous because suddenly I wasn't even sure what I was looking for anymore. A building? A missing afternoon? Proof of something? I still don't know. The truth is, I think there is probably a completely normal explanation. Memory is messy, especially childhood memory. People influence each other, stories blend together, details get borrowed. That explanation makes the most sense. Yet every few years, Lauren messages me again, usually something simple. Still remember the building. Or, I had that dream again. And every single time, I know exactly what she's talking about. 20 years later, no answers, no grand reveal. Just 6 kids who spent an afternoon somewhere at summer camp and somehow never managed to agree on what happened there.